At my 25th birthday dinner, my grandmother casually asked me how I had invested the $5 million trust fund my late grandfather left for me. The entire room went completely dead silent as I looked down at my plate and whispered the four words that shattered my mother's elaborate empire of lies. I never got one. When my grandfather's lifelong estate attorney stepped out of the shadows and placed the forensic bank statements directly onto the table, the color completely drained from my mother's face as she clutched her chest and nearly collapsed right out of her chair. My name is Madison Huff. To understand how I spent my entire youth living in near poverty while my family operated a multi-million-dollar scam behind my back, you have to understand the toxic environment my mother constructed from the day I was born. Our family lived in the affluent coastal enclave of Silver Palisades, a place where public perception, structural wealth, and social optics dictated your entire value as a human being. My mother, Victoria Huff, was a deeply narcissistic, calculating woman who reigned over the local high society charity circuits with an iron fist, while my older brother, Julian, was treated like a royal prince who could absolutely do no wrong. From the time I was a young girl, my mother enforced a rigid psychological hierarchy within our household that constantly designated me as the family's ultimate financial and emotional burden. While Julian was gifted elite private school educations, international summer trips to Europe, and a brand new luxury sports vehicle for his 16th birthday, I was systematically forced to survive on the bare minimum. My mother constantly spun a bitter, manipulative narrative that our family finances were perpetually on the brink of absolute ruin because of my basic upbringing. Whenever I needed money for school field trips, generic dental work, or basic clothing, Victoria would launch into a dramatic, tearful lecture about how my very existence was draining her dry and forcing her to make immense sacrifices just to keep a roof over our heads. Because I was thoroughly gaslit into believing that I was a financial drain on my mother, I developed an intense, almost frantic work ethic to alleviate her artificial stress. Throughout my college years, I worked two exhausting jobs, spending my early mornings as a barista and my late nights as a certified financial compliance data auditor for a local corporate firm. I put myself through a rigorous accounting degree entirely on heavy federal student loans, skipped countless meals to save a few dollars, and drove a dangerously rusted sedan with a slipping transmission that routinely leaked oil all over the pavement. Whenever I begged my mother for a tiny bit of assistance with my rising tuition costs, she would look at me with cold, aristocratic disgust and tell me that real character was built through suffering, while simultaneously cutting massive checks to fund Julian's failed luxury lifestyle businesses. Julian was a textbook golden child who possessed a smooth tongue and a complete lack of financial discipline. Over a 5-year period, he launched 3 separate boutique marketing agencies and an upscale car rental startup, all of which completely collapsed within months due to his extreme incompetence and lavish personal spending. Yet, no matter how many millions of dollars Julian managed to burn through, my mother always stepped in to completely erase his debts, publicly praising his bold entrepreneurial spirit at family gatherings, while ordering me to stay in the kitchen and clear the dinner plates. I spent my entire life feeling a profound sense of shame, completely convinced that I was simply a plain, untalented daughter who was fundamentally unworthy of her family's love and support. What I didn't know throughout those grueling years of struggle was that the dirt beneath my feet was entirely paved with gold, and that the person who truly loved me had taken steps to secure my future long before he passed away. My maternal grandfather, Charles Huff, had been an extraordinarily wealthy maritime logistics tycoon who possessed a deep, unyielding integrity. He had always seen straight through my mother Victoria's superficial vanity and Julian's lazy entitlement, recognizing early on that I was the only child in the family who inherited his genuine work ethic and sharp analytical mind. When I was just a toddler, Charles quietly established an ironclad, highly private testamentary trust fund designed specifically to ensure that I would be completely protected from my mother's toxic financial manipulation once I reached adulthood. The trust fund was legally structured with an initial principal investment of $5 million, explicitly mandated to mature and be distributed directly into my private control on my 25th birthday. However, because I was an innocent child when the trust was drafted, the legal framework required a temporary fiduciary trustee to manage the tax reporting and administrative filings until the maturity date arrived. My grandfather, assuming that basic maternal instinct would prevail over greed, mistakenly appointed my mother, Victoria, as the temporary guardian of the trust. It was the single greatest mistake of his life, and it set the stage for a 25-year campaign of systemic white-collar embezzlement that would eventually destroy our family lineage forever. The day of reckoning finally arrived on my 25th birthday. My grandmother, Evelyn Hoff, who had been living a highly reclusive life in Switzerland following my grandfather's passing, unexpectedly announced that she was flying back to the States to host a formal birthday dinner for me at the most exclusive private dining room in the Grand Horizon Hotel. My mother and Julian were ecstatic when they received the invitation, not because they cared about celebrating my milestone birthday, but because they desperately wanted to corner my wealthy grandmother to beg for a massive financial injection to save Julian's latest bankrupt real estate venture. When we arrived at the opulent dining room, the atmosphere was thick with tension and the suffocating scent of expensive perfumes and fine catering. The massive mahogany table was heavily laid with sparkling crystal stemware, polished antique silver, and rows of white burning candles. My mother, Victoria, sat regally at the center of the table, wearing a custom designer silk gown and a striking diamond necklace that I had never seen before. Julian sat right next to her, looking incredibly smug while checking his diamond-encrusted watch every few minutes. I sat quietly at the far end of the table, wearing a plain, generic beige dress that I had painstakingly purchased from a clearance rack, feeling entirely out of place in the room. Halfway through the second course of the meal, my grandmother Evelyn set her champagne flute down with a sharp, intentional click against the mahogany wood. Her sharp, piercing blue eyes scanned the room, bypassing my mother completely before locking onto me with a look of deep, profound curiosity. Sitting right beside my grandmother was an elderly, impeccably dressed gentleman carrying a heavy leather corporate briefcase, Mr. Arthur Vance, who had served as my late grandfather's personal estate attorney for over 40 decades.
Madison, my beautiful girl, now that you have officially reached this milestone age, we need to discuss your grandfather's true legacy, Evelyn said, her voice clear, commanding, and echoing perfectly through the silent dining room. Show me how you've used your $5 million trust fund after 25 years. I want to hear all about the investments, the real estate, and the corporate compliance structures you've built with the capital Charles set aside for you. A heavy, suffocating silence instantly fell over the entire room. I froze mid-bite, my fork hovering in the air as my mind tried to process the words coming out of my grandmother's mouth. I looked over at my mother, expecting her to laugh or correct a misunderstanding, but the sight of her face made my stomach drop. Victoria's posture had gone entirely rigid, her skin turning an unnatural, ghostly shade of white, as her fingers gripped her wine glass so tightly her knuckles turned purple. Julian's smug grin instantly vanished, his eyes darting frantically toward the exit doors of the private room. I cleared my dry throat, my heart hammering violently against my ribs, and looked directly into my grandmother's expectant eyes. I only whispered 4 words. I never got one. The silence that followed was deafening. My grandmother Evelyn didn't blink. Her expression merely hardened into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. She turned her head slowly toward the elderly attorney sitting beside her and gave a single, imperceptible nod. Then his lawyer placed the statements down. Mr. Vance opened the heavy brass clasps of his leather briefcase, pulled out a thick, meticulously bound stack of forensic accounting ledgers and certified banking documents, and slid them directly across the table, stopping them right in front of my plate. "What is the meaning of this theater, Evelyn?" my mother Victoria suddenly erupted, her voice cracking with a high-pitched, desperate panic as she tried to stand up from her chair. "Madison is completely exaggerating as usual. The markets have been incredibly volatile for decades. I managed her assets with the utmost care, but the principal capital suffered massive, unavoidable losses due to economic downturns. She's just an ungrateful child who doesn't understand high-level asset management." "Sit down, Victoria," Mr. Vance commanded, his voice carrying the cold weight of a seasoned federal prosecutor. He adjusted his glasses and pointed directly to the top page of the certified banking ledger. "These are the official, unedited forensic tracking statements from the Huff Maritime Trust Administration. Over the last 10 consecutive years, there were 0 market losses. Instead, there were over 42 unauthorized, highly illegal cash wire transfers siphoned directly out of Madison's trust principal, totaling exactly $4.8 million. The room seemed to spin as I stared down at the black and white bank statements. There, listed in chronological order with matching tracking numbers, were the digital fingerprints of my family's ultimate betrayal. My mother had systematically stripped my grandfather's trust fund bare, transferring hundreds of thousands of dollars at a time directly into Julian's private holding companies to fund his failed luxury lifestyles, his country club memberships, and his exotic sports cars. Even the magnificent diamond necklace resting against my mother's bare neck at that very moment had been purchased using a direct $50,000 withdrawal from my education fund during the exact semester I was skipping meals to pay for my college textbooks.
"You didn't just mismanage a fund, Victoria," Mr. Vance continued, his voice cutting through the air like a razor blade. "You committed grand larceny, fiduciary embezzlement, and systematic bank fraud against your own daughter. You abused your legal position as a temporary trustee to systematically strip a child of her lawful inheritance while forcing her to live in near poverty to hide your own financial crimes." My mother stared at the unshakable paper trail of her guilt, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water as her entire superficial reality completely collapsed around her. She turned her panicked gaze toward Julian, begging him to say something to defend them, but my brother was completely frozen in terror, realizing that his entire luxury existence was entirely built on stolen blood money. Victoria's chest began to heave violently as she clutched her throat, hyperventilating in pure panic, and she nearly collapsed right out of her expensive leather chair, sliding halfway onto the floor before the hotel staff rushed forward to stabilize her. I sat completely motionless at the end of the table, looking at the broken, weeping figures of my mother and brother, feeling absolutely zero pity, zero anger, and zero desire to offer them comfort. For 25 years, they had forced me to carry the heavy emotional burden of feeling like an expensive mistake, using my internal guilt to fund their shallow vanity while watching me struggle to survive on the fringes of their luxury world. Keeping my mouth shut, working myself to the bone, and building my own independent career had inadvertently kept me far away from the toxic financial rot that had completely corrupted their souls. The legal and financial execution that followed over the next month was a masterpiece in swift, unyielding justice. My grandmother Evelyn instantly stripped my mother of every single title, asset access, and corporate positioning within the broader Huff family estate, permanently cutting her off from any future generational wealth.
Mr. Vance turned the complete forensic audit over to the state's Commercial Crimes Division and federal financial regulators. Facing a mountain of irrefutable bank documentation and immediate criminal indictments for grand theft and fiduciary fraud, my mother was forced to sign over every single asset she personally owned, including her luxury mansion, her private investments, and her expensive jewelry collections, to my private bank account as a mandatory legal restitution settlement to avoid spending the remainder of her life in a federal penitentiary. Julian's superficial empire completely disintegrated into dust within weeks. Without my stolen trust fund capital to artificially prop up his bankrupt business ventures, his creditors descended on him like vultures. His luxury sports vehicles were publicly repossessed from his driveway, his rental contracts were summarily canceled, and he was forced to file for total personal bankruptcy. Stripped of his golden child status and his mother's stolen wealth, my brother was forced to take a grueling entry-level manual labor job at a local shipping warehouse just to afford a tiny, cramped room in a run-down part of the state, finally experiencing the harsh financial reality he had spent his entire life mocking me for.
Meanwhile, I took complete, absolute control of the remaining capital and the massive real estate assets transferred to me through the legal restitution. I used my extensive financial compliance background to invest the $39 million into high-impact, sustainable tech infrastructures, education endowment funds for underprivileged students, and clean energy developments. I left the toxic social circles of Silver Palisades far behind me, moving into a beautiful, peaceful estate surrounded by ancient oak trees and rolling hills, completely surrounded by real, honest individuals who value human character, intelligence, and genuine integrity over the empty, deceptive illusions of unearned wealth. The ultimate trajectory of your personal evolution changes the moment you realize that the individuals who give you life do not possess a permanent license to exploit your future or manipulate your sanity. True maturity means understanding that maternal guilt is often the favorite weapon of the financial parasite, and that the boundaries of your peace must be guarded with an absolute, unyielding iron wall. When the people who are legally mandated to protect your growth choose instead to harvest your inheritance in total secrecy, do not waste your life begging for their validation or weeping over their betrayal. Simply step back into the clarity of your own independent success, let the unshakable truth of the law dismantle their illusions from the inside out, and never look back at the ashes of the family you had to outgrow to step into your true kingdom.